On a quiet November evening in 1994, as the soft hum of suburban life carried through the air, Farah Fratta, a devoted mother of three, returned home. Her car reversed slowly into the garage, unaware that within moments her life would be violently taken from her. A single shot pierced the silence, and then another. Farah collapsed to the ground, her hopes for the future fading with each breath. The sound of a car door closing, the roar of an engine, and then nothing. Across the street, a neighbor heard the shots. She saw the figure, a shadow in the night, slip away. But what no one knew was that a child, a mere 7 years old, had witnessed it all. Bradley Bacher, the oldest son, would unknowingly become the key to unlocking a dark truth, a truth that would forever shatter the world he once knew. What had seemed like a random act of violence was far from it, and the true story, the twisted tale of betrayal, murder, and a father's cruel deception, was only beginning to unfold. Farah Fratta was a woman with a warmth that filled the room, a loving mother, a devoted wife, and a woman full of hope. She had dreams, like so many others, of raising her three children in a safe and happy home. Her life, to those who knew her, was one of quiet joy, spent tending to her children, caring for those around her, and finding small moments of peace in an often chaotic world. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary suburban life, a much darker reality existed, a reality that would, tragically, reveal itself on that fateful November evening. Farah had met Robert Bob Fratta years earlier, a man who appeared charming, confident, and full of promises. They had both worked as ticket agents for American Airlines, their shared professions sparking an initial connection. Bob, a man with a commanding presence, captivated Farah with his confident demeanor. But as time wore on, their marriage began to unravel. Farah, a quiet and caring soul, found herself living in the shadows of Bob's ever-growing demands and emotional cruelty. Despite their growing discord, Farah remained committed to her children, always putting them first. She wanted the best for them, and she worked hard to provide that. Yet, her personal life was filled with turbulence. Bob's domineering personality and emotionally abusive behavior cast a long shadow over their relationship. It became increasingly evident that Farah was a woman trapped, a woman whose marriage, once full of promise, had become a battleground. As Farah sought a divorce and custody of their children, the stakes grew higher. Bob's behavior became more erratic, his grip on control tightening. But Farah, despite the pressure, was determined to break free. As she fought to build a new life, Farah's strength and resilience began to show, but no one could have foreseen the tragic end that awaited her. On the evening of November 9th, 1994, her life would be taken away in the blink of an eye, an act that would forever change the lives of her children and those who loved her. It was a seemingly ordinary evening when Farah returned home. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the quiet suburban neighborhood was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Farah's car slowly reversed into her garage, just like any other night. But on this night, something was different. Something terrible was about to unfold. Across the street, in a home on a quiet tree-lined street, Laura Holscher sat nursing her infant son on the couch. The room was warm, filled with the soft, soothing sounds of a mother tending to her child. Laura had no reason to suspect that, just a few feet away, a tragedy was about to unfold. Suddenly, she heard it, a sharp, sudden sound that broke the stillness of the night. A pop. At first, Laura thought nothing of it. It could have been a car backfiring, she thought, or perhaps something else. But then she heard another. The second pop was unmistakable. It was the sound of a gunshot, and in that moment, everything changed. Laura's instincts kicked in. She looked out the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. Farah Fratta was lying motionless on the ground. The garage lights flickered and then went dark. Laura's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the scene unfolding before her. Was it a robbery? Was it a random act of violence? She quickly grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "Someone's been shot," she said, her voice shaking. "I saw a man, a black male in dark clothes. He was lying in wait. I saw him shoot her." The dispatcher on the other end of the line urged Laura to stay calm, asking for more details. Laura explained that the shooter had disappeared behind a tree, and shortly after, a car pulled up to pick him up. The car, she noted, was a silver sedan with one headlight out. As Laura spoke, Her eyes never left the window. She watched in disbelief as the scene continued to unfold before her eyes. The tension in the air was thick. Her thoughts raced, but there was no time to make sense of it all. Farah Fratta was still lying there, her body unmoving. Minutes later, Laura's husband Mark arrived at the scene. He rushed over to Farah, but it was already clear that she was clinging to life by a thread. Her injuries were grave, 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The ambulance arrived soon after, but despite the best efforts of paramedics, Farah Fratta would not survive. She was airlifted to a nearby hospital, but the injuries were too severe. Farah passed away that night, leaving behind her 3 young children and a mystery that would haunt investigators for years to come. As the paramedics worked to save her life, law enforcement arrived at the scene. It didn't take long for them to start piecing together the details of the crime. This wasn't a random act of violence or a robbery gone wrong. No, this was something far more deliberate. Farah's purse and other belongings had been left behind, untouched. It was clear that the motive wasn't financial, but what was it then? Who would want to kill a mother of 3? Bob Fratta stood at the scene, his eyes scanning the chaos around him. The air was thick with tension, but he remained calm. The sight of his wife lying lifeless mere feet from where he stood seemed to have little impact on him. While those around him were consumed with shock and disbelief, Bob appeared to be only concerned with one thing: defending his alibi. His focus was not on the loss of his wife, nor on the trauma his children were undoubtedly experiencing, but on making sure his whereabouts were accounted for during the time of the murder. There, in the midst of the turmoil, Bob's behavior seemed out of place. It was as if he was acting more like a stranger than a grieving husband. His lack of concern, his cold detachment, caught the attention of the investigators immediately. This wasn't the reaction of a man whose life had just been torn apart. His primary concern was himself, his defense, his story. While others asked questions, Bob was already presenting his alibi. The police weren't the only ones who took note of this. Neighbors, friends, and even acquaintances began to reflect on Bob's behavior leading up to the murder. To those who knew him, the picture of a loving husband and father was hard to reconcile with the man they were seeing in the wake of Farah's death. Friends and coworkers who had witnessed Bob's life from the outside began to recall moments of tension between the couple, their broken marriage, and Bob's growing sense of control over his wife's every move. For those close to the Fratta family, it was becoming clear that this was no ordinary domestic dispute. It was something far more complicated. Farah Fratta, despite her best efforts, had been living in a marriage that had long since ceased to be healthy. While Bob had always projected an image of charm and confidence to the world, behind closed doors there was a darker side, a side that Farah had come to know all too well. Farah had tried to hold things together for the sake of her children, but as the years went by, her relationship with Bob deteriorated. Bob's domineering nature had gradually eroded the love they once shared. He was a man who had a desire for control over every aspect of Farah's life. This was a man who was not afraid to use manipulation, emotional cruelty, and harsh words to ensure that Farah remained under his thumb. Farah, a gentle and quiet soul, had begun to wither under the pressure. Bob's behavior had become erratic over time. Friends who once saw him as the life of the party now described him as moody and unpredictable. His emotional abuse was subtle, but it had left a lasting mark on Farah, one she could no longer ignore. She began to seek a way out, knowing that for her and her children, life could never be normal under the roof they shared. As Farah fought for her freedom, the stakes grew higher. She was no longer content to remain in a toxic marriage. The once loving couple now found themselves in the midst of a bitter divorce. The battle for custody of their 3 young children intensified, with Bob determined not to let go of the life he had built for himself. Farah, on the other hand, was determined to escape the emotional imprisonment that had defined her marriage. The divorce proceedings became a battleground. As the custody fight raged on, Farah began to take steps to secure her future. Seeking not only custody but financial support for her children. She had been more than just a wife. She had been a mother, a worker, a caregiver. But Bob Fratta feeling the pressure of losing control over both his family and his finances, grew desperate. His fear of losing everything, of being forced to pay child support, began to cloud his judgment. In his mind, the stakes had reached a dangerous level. The thought of his ex-wife gaining custody of the children, of losing access to the life he had once taken for granted, gnawed at him. Bob Fratta began to entertain thoughts that no man in his position should have. He spoke to friends and acquaintances about the possibility of finding someone who would take care of Farah, someone who would eliminate the problem once and for all. These conversations, spoken in hushed tones and casual whispers, were later revealed to be more than just idle chatter. Bob had begun to look for someone to kill his wife, to take matters into his own hands in a way that would leave no trace of his involvement. His desperation became clear in these subtle exchanges. What began as casual mentions soon turned into serious inquiries. Bob, for reasons only he could understand, felt he had no other option. But even as Bob's mind seemed to turn darker, he continued to maintain his innocence. When questioned by investigators, he stuck to his alibi with unwavering conviction. He claimed he was at church during the time of the murder, his children by his side, his whereabouts confirmed by those who saw him there. It seemed like an airtight story. The more he spoke, the more convincing he appeared. To many, it seemed like the truth, but not to the investigators. They sensed something wasn't right. Bob's demeanor, his insistence on presenting his alibi in such a calculated manner, was the first crack in the facade of innocence. The detectives could not ignore the way Bob's behavior clashed with the gravity of the situation. He wasn't asking about his wife. He wasn't concerned about the details of the investigation. Instead, he was obsessed with proving his alibi, focusing on details that seemed to be of little importance. As the investigation continued, the focus slowly shifted. The detectives began to suspect that Bob Fratta's calmness, his focus on his own defense, might be more than just a strange reaction to grief. There was a growing sense that the truth was hiding in plain sight, masked by the very behaviors that should have raised alarms. The investigation delved deeper into Bob's history, unearthing more and more unsettling facts. He was not just a man going through a tough divorce. He was a man whose behavior and actions had raised red flags long before that fateful night. It wasn't just his demands for control over Farah that troubled investigators. It was his repeated efforts to manipulate and dominate every situation, every person around him. Yet still, there was no direct evidence to link him to the murder. And for a time, investigators had no choice but to keep searching, hoping to find that one crucial piece of the puzzle that would connect him to Farah's death. But sometimes, the key to unraveling a mystery lies not in what is said, but in what is left unsaid. It was in the gaps, in the strange alibis, in the odd behavior at the crime scene, that the truth was starting to reveal itself. Slowly, but unmistakably, Bob Fratta's role in Farah's death was far from over, and the journey to uncovering that truth was just beginning. The investigation into the murder of Farah Fratta had only just begun, but the detectives already faced the daunting task of navigating a web of confusion, suspicion, and incomplete information. The shooting had been swift and brutal, leaving behind few clues at the scene. Yet, as is often the case in the most complex of investigations, the smallest details would soon begin to reveal themselves. The initial focus, of course, had been on Bob Fratta, the husband of the victim. The detectives had already noted his strange behavior at the crime scene. While others were understandably upset, Bob appeared almost too composed, almost to the point of indifference. He spent more time defending his alibi than expressing concern for his wife's fate. There was something off about his reaction, but with his alibi seemingly confirmed by the churchgoers who had seen him there, the case seemed to be at an impasse. But there was more to the story, and the detectives knew it. They began to dig into Bob's past, looking for clues that might shed light on his involvement. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Bob Fratta was not the man he appeared to be. A picture began to emerge of a man who had spent years manipulating those around him, his wife, his children, and even the people who thought they knew him best. As investigators pored over his background, they learned of the tensions between Bob and Farah, which had only worsened as their divorce proceedings dragged on. The couple's troubled marriage had been well known among those close to them. Bob's behavior had become more erratic, more controlling, and more desperate. Farah's decision to end the marriage had left Bob seething with rage. He had much to lose: the children, the financial security, and most crucially, his sense of power. Farah was taking it all away from him, and in Bob's mind, there was only one way to stop it. While Bob had maintained his innocence, something about his behavior in the days leading up to the murder was beginning to raise red flags. Witnesses who had spoken with him at the gym recalled Bob's repeated complaints about the divorce and the prospect of losing custody of the children. He had become obsessed with the idea of losing everything. Some had even overheard him asking if anyone knew of a way to make his wife disappear. The questions were casual at first, as if Bob had never considered the possibility of taking such drastic action. But with each passing day, those casual comments seemed less like idle chatter and more like a desperate cry for help. It wasn't long before the investigators started to focus on Bob's interactions with Mary Gipp, a woman who seemed to have an unsettling connection to Bob. Gipp, who had once been involved with Bob's gym acquaintance, Joseph Pristash, became a key figure in the investigation. Investigators learned that Gipp had been a critical part of the chain that connected Bob to the murder. She had been in contact with Bob in the days leading up to the murder, and phone records soon revealed that they had been speaking frequently. Gipp's involvement raised the stakes, and soon she was under the investigators' microscope. The investigators, however, were still unsure of how far Bob's reach had gone in orchestrating the murder. There was no clear evidence linking him directly to the crime, and the mystery deepened as they continued to probe into his life. Yet, the more they examined the phone records, the more it seemed that Bob had been planning something far more sinister than anyone had initially realized. The phone calls between Bob and Gipp had become more frequent and more pointed. Was this a simple exchange between two acquaintances, or was Bob making arrangements to have his wife killed? The investigators' suspicions grew stronger when they traced the phone numbers to Pristash and his accomplice, Howard Guidry. It became clear that Bob had orchestrated the entire plot with the help of others. Pristash, a man who had once been a trusted confidant of Bob's, was now implicated as the middleman. He had been the one to introduce Guidry to the situation, setting the stage for the fatal encounter. The realization that Bob had enlisted the help of others in his quest to end his wife's life sent a shiver through the investigators. The case was beginning to take shape as a carefully planned murder-for-hire scheme. But there was still more to uncover. The investigators' persistence soon paid off when they obtained additional testimony from a critical witness. Pristash, in an effort to protect himself, eventually admitted his role in the plot. He revealed how Bob had offered him money and a car to take care of Farah, to eliminate her as a threat to his future. Pristash confessed that he had brought in Howard Guidry, a man with a violent history, to carry out the murder. It was the final piece of the puzzle that investigators had been searching for. As they pieced together the events leading up to the night of Farah's murder, the investigators realized just how methodical Bob had been. From the calculated planning to the careful execution, Bob had thought of everything. He had ensured that his tracks were covered, even down to the phone calls that connected him to Pristash and Guidry. It was clear that this was no spur-of-the-moment crime. It had been planned for months, carefully crafted to make it appear as though Farah's death was a random act of violence. But the more the investigators uncovered, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Bob's alibi, once thought to be ironclad, was now being called into question. The phone records told a different story. Bob's whereabouts, which had seemed clear, were now clouded with doubt. Investigators discovered that during the time of the shooting, Bob had made several phone calls to both Pristash and Gipp. These calls, once innocent enough, were now seen as a clear indication that Bob had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The tension in the investigation mounted as the investigators moved closer to uncovering the truth. They had their lead suspects, Farah Fratta, Joseph Pristash, and Howard Guidry, but there was still the matter of tying everything together. The case was complex, filled with false leads and distractions, But with each piece of evidence they uncovered, the truth became clearer. And then the breakthrough came. Witness testimony, phone records, and the confession of Joseph Pristash all pointed to Bob Fratta as the mastermind behind the murder. It was a devastating revelation, one that shattered any remaining doubts about Bob's role in his wife's death. The investigators had done their job, and they had uncovered the truth, no matter how difficult it was to accept. As the pieces of the puzzle fit together, the detectives knew they had the evidence they needed to bring Bob Fratta to justice. What had seemed like a random tragedy had, in reality, been a cold-blooded act of murder, carefully planned and executed by a man desperate to maintain control of his life at any cost. The investigation was far from over, but the evidence was undeniable. Bob Fratta's involvement in his wife's death was now irrefutable. The confession from Pristash was a pivotal moment in the investigation, but it was not enough to close the case. There was still the question of how Bob had managed to orchestrate the murder without directly involving himself. The key lay in Howard Guidry, the man who had actually pulled the trigger. But as the investigators dug into Guidry's past, they discovered that he, too, had ties to the Fratta case. It was as if every step Bob had taken to hide his involvement had been meticulously planned, and each step had left a trail for the investigators to follow. And follow they did. With the confession of Pristash and the evidence linking Bob to the murder, the case began to come together with chilling clarity. Bob Fratta had, in fact, orchestrated the murder of his wife, but he hadn't done it alone. He had enlisted the help of two other men, Pristash and Guidry, each of whom had played a crucial role in the execution of his plan. What had seemed like an innocent question, a passing remark about having his wife killed, had turned into a full-blown conspiracy. Bob had carefully chosen his accomplices, using them to execute his plan while keeping his own hands clean. The twist in the case, the revelation that Bob Fratta had hired someone to kill his wife, was a devastating one. It wasn't just a crime of passion, as many had initially suspected. It was a cold, calculated act of murder. Bob had plotted and planned for months, carefully arranging every detail to ensure that Farah's death would appear as anything but what it truly was, a deliberate and well-executed murder for hire. The betrayal was staggering. Bob, who had once promised to love and cherish Farah, had orchestrated her death with chilling precision. He had not only killed his wife, but had used the people around him to do it. His own family, his children, his friends, none of them had known the depths of his deception. The man they had all trusted was not the loving father and husband they thought he was. He was a man who had manipulated everyone around him for his own gain, willing to sacrifice the life of his wife to preserve his own. And the final betrayal came when Mary Gipp, the woman Bob had trusted, betrayed him for her own safety. She had been the one to connect Bob with Pristash, and Pristash had been the one to connect Bob to Guidry. Yet, when the heat of the investigation began to close in, Gipp turned on Bob, providing the authorities with the critical information that ultimately led to his arrest. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment when the truth finally emerged, and the once perfect facade of the Fratta family crumbled to dust. The revelation of Bob Fratta's involvement in his wife's murder sent shockwaves through the community. It was a story of manipulation, betrayal, and cold-hearted calculation. What had seemed like a random act of violence was in fact a well-planned murder for hire. And as the truth came to light, the weight of that truth left everyone reeling. The day had arrived, the day when the quiet, painful truth would finally be spoken aloud in a court of law. The moment the investigation had led to, the one that would ultimately seal the fate of Bob Fratta. Yet the words that would bring clarity to the case, the words that would unravel the final threads of deception, would come from the unlikeliest of sources, a 7-year-old boy named Bradley Bakr. Bradley, a young child whose life had already been irreversibly altered by the death of his mother, Farah, found himself in the most unimaginable position. There, in the stark, imposing courtroom, he was about to give testimony that would change everything. But he did not fully understand the weight of his words, nor the gravity of what was about to transpire. At that moment, Bradley was simply a child, a boy who had lost his mother and whose world had been turned upside down. As he walked into the courtroom, hand in hand with the guardian, the air in the room thickened with tension. The trial of his father, Bob Fratta, had already revealed the chilling truth of the murder-for-hire plot, but it was Bradley's testimony that would confirm the reality of it all. The very man who had raised him, the father who had once been his protector, was now the man on trial for orchestrating the murder of his mother. For Bradley, it was a cruel twist of fate. He had no idea that his own words would seal his father's fate. Prosecutor Kelly Siegler, a woman who had been tirelessly working on the case, watched as the young boy took his seat on the witness stand. She had known this moment was coming. She had prepared for it. But nothing could have fully prepared her for the sight of the boy whose life had been torn apart by the very man who should have loved and protected him. Bradley's presence in the courtroom was a stark reminder of the emotional toll the case had taken on everyone involved. Bradley, nervously looking out at the crowd, did not fully grasp the significance of the situation. His mind, still processing the trauma of the loss of his mother and the realization that his father was the one who had orchestrated her murder, could not yet understand the enormity of the words he was about to speak. Yet, when the time came, he spoke with an honesty and simplicity that would leave the courtroom in stunned silence. Kelly Siegler, sitting just across from him, knew this moment would be critical. She had already witnessed the devastation of the family firsthand. She had seen the pain in Bradley's eyes, the sadness that seemed to weigh him down with every passing day. But in that moment, she knew something even more profound was unfolding, something that no one, least of all Bob Fratta, could have predicted. With the quiet hum of the courtroom around them, Bradley began to speak. His small voice, barely above a whisper, filled the air. As he answered the questions posed to him by the prosecutor, there was an undeniable tension. The words that came from Bradley's mouth were simple but direct. He spoke of his father's behavior in the days leading up to his mother's murder, of the calls he had heard his father make, calls that to him were nothing more than fleeting moments in time. To a child, the weight of these events was far less clear than it was to the adults in the room. But as Bradley spoke, one particular question changed everything. "Bradley, can you tell us where you were the night your mother was shot?" Kelly asked, her voice steady, though the weight of the moment hung heavily between them. Without hesitation, Bradley recounted the evening with childlike precision. He spoke of sitting in the car with his younger siblings, his father leaving them alone at the restaurant, and of his confusion at his father's behavior during that time. As he spoke, Bradley did not know that his words were tying his father directly to the murder. Then came the moment, the question that would forever change the course of the trial. "Bradley," Kelly said, her voice gentle yet firm, "can you tell us what your father did when you were at the restaurant?" In that moment, Bradley pointed his small finger toward his father, sitting across the room. There at the defense table, Bob Fratta sat motionless, his eyes fixed forward. Bradley, his expression calm and uncertain, simply said, "He left us and went to make phone calls." The room fell silent. The impact of Bradley's words reverberated through the courtroom. It was a moment that could not be ignored. There, before the judge, the jury, and everyone present, Bradley had unwittingly provided the key piece of evidence that tied Bob to the crime. The calls Bradley described were the same calls investigators had uncovered during their search of Bob's phone records. The calls to Mary Gipp, the woman who had been part of the murder-for-hire plot. It was these calls that had confirmed Bob's role in orchestrating the murder of his wife, Farah. Bradley's testimony was not dramatic or theatrical. There was no grand speech or emotional outburst. There was only a child, confused and heartbroken, recounting the events as he remembered them. Yet, in the simplicity of his words, he had unknowingly placed the final nail in his father's coffin. It was a devastating realization for everyone in the courtroom, but none more so than for Bradley himself. As Bradley finished his testimony, Kelly Siegler's heart ached for the boy sitting before her. She knew the toll this trial had taken on him. She knew that he was not only testifying against the man who had betrayed his family, but against the very person who had once been his protector, the man who had raised him. It was a burden that no child should ever have to carry. For Bradley, it was a moment of bittersweet clarity. His testimony had done what it needed to do. It had sealed the truth. But at what cost? For a 7-year-old boy, the realization that his father was capable of such cruelty would take a lifetime to understand. It was a wound that would never fully heal. As the court session continued, the weight of the moment lingered. Bradley's testimony had stripped away any remaining doubt. It was no longer a case of speculation or circumstantial evidence. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. Bob Fratta, the man who had once been a father, a protector, a provider, was now revealed as the mastermind behind his wife's murder. In the days that followed, Bradley's testimony would remain a haunting reminder of the impact this case had on a young child. For Kelly Siegler, the prosecutor who had guided Bradley through the ordeal, it was a moment that would stay with her forever. She knew that in this case, it was not just the truth of the crime that had been revealed, it was the truth of the devastation that such a betrayal could wreak on a family and on a child who had already lost so much. It was in that moment, that quiet, painful moment, that the case was no longer about just the murder of Farah Fratta. It was about the brokenness of a family and the innocence lost in the pursuit of justice. The trial of Bob Fratta had reached its apex, a moment long awaited by those who had followed the heartbreaking case from the very beginning. It was a trial that had unfolded with a painful inevitability, a slow and methodical process that had revealed the cold, calculated nature of the crime. The courtroom had become a place where for months the weight of a shattered family had been placed under intense scrutiny. For Farah Fratta's loved ones, the trial had been a long and harrowing journey toward justice, but it had also been a painful reminder of the horrors they had witnessed, of the betrayal that had torn their lives apart. For Bob Fratta, the end was near. He sat in the courtroom, his face a mask of stoic indifference, betraying no sign of the mounting tension that swirled around him. He had denied his role in his wife's death from the very beginning, clinging to the belief that his alibi, his defense, would be enough to convince the jury of his innocence. But as the trial progressed, the walls had closed in around him, and the truth had come to light in such a way that it could not be ignored. He had orchestrated the murder of Farah with chilling precision, using the people around him to carry out his plans while keeping himself at a safe distance. And now, after all the testimony, the evidence, and the confessions, the jury would soon decide his fate. It had been a tense few days of deliberation. The jury, composed of individuals from all walks of life, had been tasked with deciding whether Bob Fratta would walk free or face the consequences of his actions. They had heard the testimony of countless witnesses, including that of his young son, Bradley, whose innocent words had unwittingly confirmed the damning evidence against his father. They had listened to the cold confessions of Joseph Pristash and Howard Guidry, 2 men who had been part of the murder-for-hire plot, and they had seen, through the eyes of those who knew Farah and Bob, just how deeply the betrayal had cut. Now the jury had reached their verdict. The room fell into a heavy silence as the foreman stood to read the decision. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him as he spoke the words that would mark the end of Bob Fratta's long, drawn-out trial. We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Fratta, guilty of capital murder. The words echoed in the courtroom like a thunderclap, sending a ripple of shock through the room. For Farah's family, there was a mix of relief and sorrow. The truth had finally been acknowledged. The man who had taken Farah's life was now facing the consequences of his actions. But for her loved ones, there was no true relief. Farah was gone, and nothing could bring her back. The verdict had come too late to undo the damage that had been done, too late to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. As the jury filed out of the courtroom, the focus shifted to the next phase of the trial, the sentencing. Bob Fratta, still silent, sat in his chair, awaiting the decision that would seal his fate. The prosecutor, Kelly Siegler, had worked tirelessly throughout the trial, and now she stood before the judge, ready to deliver the closing arguments for the penalty phase. In her remarks, Siegler reflected on the life Farah had once had, a life full of promise and hope. Farah had been a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a friend. She had loved her children deeply, and she had dreamed of a future filled with happiness and peace. But that future had been stolen from her by the very person she had trusted the most, the man who had promised to protect her, the man who had once been her husband. Farah's death, Siegler argued, was not the result of a fleeting moment of passion or an accidental act. It had been the result of a carefully laid plan, orchestrated by a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. The courtroom grew heavy with emotion as Siegler's words struck a chord with those present. For Farah's parents, her children, and her friends, this was the moment of reckoning. It was the moment when the final chapter of their painful journey would be written. The loss of Farah was immeasurable, but at least now there was justice. Justice for her children, for her family, and for the woman whose life had been so cruelly taken. Bob Fratta, sitting motionless in the defendant's chair, heard the words of the prosecutor and remained silent. Throughout the trial, he had maintained his innocence, refusing to acknowledge the magnitude of his actions. Now, facing the death penalty, he still showed no remorse, no sign of understanding the full scope of the damage he had caused. His eyes were fixed forward, but there was no emotion, no hint of the man he once had been. He was a figure of cold detachment, consumed by his own arrogance and refusal to face the truth of his actions. As the judge prepared to hand down the sentence, the courtroom remained silent, the air thick with anticipation. The decision had been made. Bob Fratta's fate was now sealed. The words came slowly, each one carrying the weight of the moment. Robert Fratta, having been convicted of capital murder, the court sentences you to death. The words hung in the air, final and irrevocable. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the court was adjourned. For Farah's family, the sentence brought a bittersweet sense of closure. The man who had murdered their daughter, their sister, their mother, had been held accountable for his actions. But that accountability could never replace the loss they had suffered. Farah's children would grow up without their mother, a void that would never be filled. And for Bradley, the boy who had been forced to testify against his own father, the emotional toll was just beginning. For the community, the trial had been a painful reminder of the darkness that could lurk behind closed doors, even in the most seemingly normal of families. The case had shaken the foundations of trust, revealing the ugly truth about the man who had once been a respected member of the community. It was a case that would linger in the minds of those who had followed it, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the depths to which some would sink in the pursuit of their own desires. As Bob Fratta was led away, the courtroom emptied and the world moved on. But for those who had been touched by this tragedy, there was no moving on. There was only the knowledge that despite the verdict, some wounds would never fully heal. In the years following the conviction of Bob Fratta, Bradley Bakir's life has been marked by a quiet, painful journey of growth, healing, and understanding. A young boy at the time of his mother's murder, Bradley was thrust into a world no child should ever have to endure. The murder of his mother, Farah, was not just the loss of a parent, it was the loss of his innocence, his sense of trust, and his perception of the world around him. The man who should have been his protector, his father, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way, orchestrating the murder of the woman who had loved him most. Bradley's testimony, which had unknowingly sealed his father's fate, was the first step in a long process of facing a truth that no child should ever have to face. At 7 years old, he found himself caught between the conflicting emotions of love for his father and the reality of his father's actions. For Bradley, the idea of justice was never clear-cut. How could a child understand the intricacies of law and morality when the most foundational truth of all had been shattered? In the years after the trial, Bradley struggled to come to terms with what had happened. His relationship with his father had been destroyed, but the emotional scars left by the betrayal ran much deeper. Every memory of his childhood, every moment he had spent with Bob was now tainted by the knowledge that his father had been the mastermind behind the crime that had forever changed his life. The very foundation of his identity, the man he had looked up to, had turned out to be a killer. Bradley's anger, though it was subdued by his age and understanding, was always present. It was an anger that lay hidden under the surface, but it shaped the way he interacted with the world. How could he trust anyone again? How could he reconcile the love he had once felt for a man who had caused so much pain? The emotions that swirled inside him, betrayal, confusion, sorrow, were too complex for a child to process alone. Yet as he grew older, those feelings did not dissipate. They simply found new forms of expression. In time, Bradley came to understand that his journey toward healing was not one he would walk alone. The support of his family, his mother's side of the family, was a critical part of his recovery. They had been his anchors, guiding him through the darkest days and offering him love when he felt abandoned. His mother's family, too, had been victims of Bob's actions. They, too, had to grapple with the knowledge that a man they once trusted had caused them immeasurable pain. But in their shared grief, they found solace in one another. As Bradley continued to grow, he found himself haunted not only by the loss of his mother, but by the fact that the person responsible for her death was someone he had once called family. This haunting presence loomed over every achievement, every milestone. His father, even in death, remained a part of his life, a part of his story, one that Bradley could neither embrace nor forget. Bob's execution in 2003 had brought a sense of finality to the case, but it had not erased the hurt or the anger. Yet, as the years passed, Bradley began to understand that justice had been served. Bob had been held accountable for his actions. He had been convicted, and he had been sentenced to death. The legal system had done what it was supposed to do, but the emotional toll on Bradley, the son of the convicted murderer, was an entirely different matter. For him, there was no easy resolution. There was no moment when everything suddenly made sense, no clear-cut sense of closure. Instead, Bradley had to learn to live with the consequences of his father's actions, to find a way to move forward while carrying the weight of his past. In interviews and public statements, Bradley has spoken with a quiet, somber clarity about the pain he carries with him. The emotional scars of growing up with a father who ultimately betrayed him remain part of who he is, part of the complex tapestry of his life. The man who raised him, the man who should have been his protector, had taken away the very thing that mattered most, the security of a loving family. And yet, despite this betrayal, Bradley continued to push forward. He learned that healing is not a destination but a process that takes time and cannot be rushed. For Bradley, the true path to healing came in understanding the complicated nature of forgiveness. Forgiveness, he came to realize, was not about absolving his father's actions. It was not about forgetting what had happened. Forgiveness was about freeing himself from the emotional weight of his father's crime. It was about finding a way to live his life without constantly being defined by the trauma that had shaped his early years. It was about making peace with a past that could never be undone. The grief and betrayal Bradley experienced were not easily overcome. There is no neatly tied conclusion to the story of a child who has lost so much. But Bradley, as he grew older, found strength in the memories of his mother, in the support of his family, and in the realization that justice, though it had been served, could not heal the emotional wounds of betrayal. He found solace in the idea that justice had not been an end, but a new beginning. A beginning that allowed him to live his life as best as he could, knowing that the worst of his past was behind him. Though he may never fully understand the depths of his father's betrayal, Bradley has come to accept that it is part of his story. It is a story that is marked by loss, by pain, but also by survival and resilience. The emotional toll, while still present, no longer defines him. It is a part of who he is, but it does not define his future. As Bradley moves forward in life, he does so with the knowledge that he survived. He survived the loss of his mother, the betrayal by his father, and the heartache of growing up in the shadow of a crime that changed everything. And while justice may have been served, it is clear that for Bradley Becerra, the true healing comes not from the courts or the law, but from within himself. For all those affected by Farah Fratta's death, there remains a bittersweet truth. Justice has been served, but at a great cost. The scars remain, carried by those who loved Farah and those who were left behind. Yet in the end, Bradley's journey toward peace is a reminder that the human spirit, though scarred, is resilient. And in the end, it is the ability to keep moving forward despite the weight of the past that defines the future.